Hello, and welcome to Fear Noir. Before we begin, take a moment to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I always enjoy reading them. If you enjoy slow, unsettling stories that gently draw you deeper into the darkness, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, let your body settle into stillness, and allow the noise of the outside world to slowly fade into silence. Tonight, the darkness has a story waiting for you. So, close your eyes, listen carefully, and let yourself drift into Fear Noir. Story 1. The funeral of Dr. Hans Ezekiel was a subdued affair. Closed casket, as the circumstances demanded, and attended by a modest gathering of family members, a fair number of his students and colleagues from the university, and a handful of local law enforcement who stood near the back with the practiced stillness of people who attended these things professionally. It was one of the latter who pulled me aside at the event's close to take my statement, drawing me away from the remaining mourners with a hand on my elbow and a look that suggested this was not optional. I had been overlooked in the initial round of questioning, passed over in the organized chaos that follows a sudden and violent death in a remote location, but the testimonies provided by my superiors had proven sufficient for the sheriff's office to reach its ruling regarding Dr. Ezekiel's passing. The determination had been made. Animal attack, likely a wolf or brown bear, consistent with the wounds and with the wildlife known to inhabit that part of rural Poland. I knew this determination to be wrong, or at least dramatically incomplete. I knew the events of that night to have a far more sordid and far less classifiable explanation. But I was not certain of exactly what I had seen, and I was content enough with the official ruling to have kept my silence, having no desire to drag myself back through the horrors I had witnessed, and no expectation that anyone would take me seriously if I did. When the surly officer finally pressed me for my account, I gave it to him as I relay it here now. I was a student of archaeology in my senior year at Miskatonic University, and Dr. Ezekiel was my professor and my sponsor, the man who had taken an interest in my academic development and given it direction and momentum. I had gotten on quite well with the doctor during my time under his instruction, and had come to admire him enormously in the way that young people admire the figures who first show them what a life devoted to serious intellectual pursuit can look like. When he came to offer me a position as part of a research team headed to the Polish countryside, I accepted without hesitation and with an enthusiasm that I now look back on with something complicated that is not quite regret and not quite grief, but contains elements of both. After weeks of meticulous preparation, I joined the doctor on a vessel bound for Europe. It was during this initial crossing that I had my first taste of the strangeness that was to come, though I did not recognize it as such at the time. It was a sunny afternoon, and I was standing at the railing on the deck, looking out at the horizon the way I did every day we were at sea. Having spent most of my life landlocked, the ocean struck me as a thing of genuine awe, vast and indifferent, and beautiful in a way that made me feel both very small and very alive. What it did not make me feel was, well, and I was in the middle of losing my breakfast over the side when Dr. Ezekiel appeared beside me with an expression of amused sympathy. I looked at him from my undignified position at the railing and told him I was finding the passage just fine, which made him smile. Then, once I had recovered some semblance of composure and straightened up to look out at the blue again, I asked the question that my initial excitement had somehow crowded out entirely. What precisely were we expected to unearth at our destination? The doctor took up a position beside me at the railing and looked out over the water for a moment before he answered. He told me we had been sent to investigate a burial mound found on the property of an old manor that had recently passed into the ownership of an eccentric collector from Providence, a man who had specifically requested the doctor's expertise in ancient archaeology. I asked, showing rather more confidence than was warranted, whether it was a Celtic burial mound this far east. The doctor corrected me gently and told me the site appeared to be Gothic in nature, and I felt the heat of embarrassment move up through my face as I chided myself for the foolishness of my assumption. But Dr. Ezekiel was already continuing, seemingly unbothered by my error, and what he said next drove the embarrassment entirely from my mind. He told me he had read the initial reporting on the site, and that there was a great deal of oddity surrounding the grave beyond its unusual location. The property itself, he explained, had changed hands with disturbing frequency throughout its existence, and in ways that were rarely peaceful. Before arriving at our current benefactor, it had been occupied by a high-ranking Nazi official and his entourage, who had themselves taken the land through violence from a Polish noble. That noble had been the last of a long and once prominent family, whose members had ranged across the world, from Scandinavia to Romania, and who had, without exception and without adequate explanation, seemed to perish with very little pretense. There was, the doctor said, a great deal of rumor and superstition and local fear attached to the property, stretching back across generations. The people of the surrounding area had long claimed that each successive caretaker of the land had been a sorcerer of some kind, in league with powers that had no business being invoked. He told me the rest was for us to discover ourselves, and then he looked out at the sea for a long moment without speaking, and I felt a shiver move down my spine that I could not entirely attribute to the salt air. After our arrival at port, we took the Orient Express into Poland, and then chartered a bus for the remaining distance. The urban landscape gradually giving way to rolling hills and small rural villages as the hours passed. When we finally arrived at the isolated manor, it looked exactly like a place that had been quietly decaying for a very long time. A rusted fence enclosed the property. A long neglected cobbled path led to the entrance. Moss and lichen covered most of the structure's exterior, and what could be seen beneath the vegetation was rotting wood and crumbling stone, and windows that had been broken long enough ago that nothing remained to suggest they had ever been whole. A thin, persistent fog moved through the grounds and gave the place the quality of a landscape glimpsed through a dream, real but not entirely, present but uncertain. The first day was occupied with unpacking equipment and personal belongings, and Dr. Ezekiel and I made our beds in a room on the second floor that had remained mostly intact while the rest of the manor crumbled around it. The following morning we broke our fast and made the short hike to the burial mound that had prompted our journey across the world. If the manor was unsettling, then the burial mound was something beyond what I had language for at the time. It was surrounded on all sides by crucifixes of every conceivable make and material, standing at irregular intervals in the earth like a silent congregation assembled against something it dared not name directly. At the tomb's head there stood a single rune stone, remarkable in itself given that its presence this far east was without precedent in any record I had ever encountered. By afternoon, a team of laborers had opened the burial place, and Dr. Ezekiel and I entered the darkness with our electric lights which did less to banish the shadows than I would have liked. I nearly dropped my light when the doctor broke the silence of the crypt with a sharp exclamation. I leaned over his shoulder to see what he had found, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the underground air move through me as I understood what I was looking at. 3 coffins occupied the cramped chamber. 2 were wooden. The third was carved from dark basalt and sat perpendicular to the others, and the beam of the doctor's light had caught a gleam on its lid where a small object rested. He pocketed it quickly, laid an unsteady hand on the surface of the stone sarcophagus, as if trying to coax something from it through the contact alone, and then said, in a voice that was slightly too dreamy to be entirely comfortable, that we should return the following day with proper equipment. I agreed with more enthusiasm than I showed, deeply relieved to have a reason to leave. That night my sleep was deeply troubled. I suffered a series of murky and suffocating nightmares that all concluded the same way, with the sound of a coffin lid creaking open and something clawed and fast emerging from the blackness inside it to close around my throat. I was sluggish and reluctant the following morning, and did everything I could to conceal this from the doctor, who seemed by contrast to have an urgency about him that had not been there the evening before. He showed me the pendant before we reached the burial site, holding it up by its tarnished chain so the morning light could find it. He had been through his reference materials and believed he had identified it. His initial impression had been of a Lutheran rose, but the contents of the grave were far too ancient for that. The amulet showed a lion bearing a cross on its shoulder, holding a sword aloft before the image of a monstrous figure with rows of teeth, like a shark. After considerable searching, the doctor told me he had matched the description. It was a seal of Saint Leo, he who had stood before Attila the Hun and turned him away from Rome. I asked about the rune stone. The doctor told me its markings, translated as accurately as he could manage, read, "May death keep this one." I turned this over in my mind as we walked, and I was still turning it over when we reached the entrance to the burial mound, and I lifted the heavy case of equipment that had been left there by a laborer. I followed the doctor back into the suffocating dark, and almost immediately he swore in a way I had never heard him swear before, and strode quickly across the chamber to the basalt sarcophagus, whose heavy lid was now propped against its side. He looked into it, and his body went rigid. When he spoke, his voice carried the specific quality of someone who is frightened and working very hard to remain precise and academic because it is the only tool they have. What lay inside had crossed arms and wore the style of Gothic nobility, and clutched a crown of unalloyed gold in one desiccated hand dusted with a fine black powder. Its eyes were open and glazed to a white that seemed to generate its own faint light from somewhere behind the surface. Its lips were drawn back to reveal a set of teeth that were jagged and sharp, and arranged in the expression of something that has identified its prey. The doctor moved quickly then, returning with a crowbar, and pried open the 2 wooden coffins with crashes that seemed obscene in the silence of that underground chamber. Both contained skeletons dressed in rags that had once been something finer. The doctor wiped sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand and said quietly that he would need a colleague to examine the remains and that he thought that would be enough for that day. And he gave me a smile that was doing its best under the circumstances. The rest of the day I spent outside documenting the crosses that encircled the burial site, while the doctor remained indoors with his books. By evening he was seated at the heavy oak desk with a whiskey in one hand and the amulet in the other, staring into it, and I could hear him muttering fragments to himself that I caught in pieces without being able to assemble them into anything coherent. Something about descriptions by Abdul al-Hazred of a race of creatures that fed on and corrupted human flesh. Something about an obscure engraving depicting a Gothic king draining blood from a priest. Something about the lost grave of the scourge of God himself. I went to bed early and left him to his wanderings. The nightmares returned, and then were cut short by something that was not a nightmare. A scream tore through the silence of the manor's deepest hour, the kind of sound that reaches into sleep and yanks you out of it by force. I was on my feet before I was fully conscious, moving toward the door as I heard others in the building coming awake around me. My hand was on the cold brass of the handle when something caught at the edge of my vision, and I turned. Dr. Ezekiel was not in his bed. The bedding was undisturbed, which meant he had never retired for the night. Movement in the brush outside the window pulled me across the room. I pressed close to the glass and looked out into the light of a full moon that had turned the fog silver. And what I saw took the strength from every muscle in my body simultaneously. Dr. Ezekiel was being held by a figure that was shaped like a man, but was not one, gaunt in a way that suggested the wrong relationship between bone and skin, with one clawed hand pressed over the doctor's mouth. As I watched, the figure opened a mouth full of teeth that were razored and irregular and bit down into the doctor's throat. The blood came in a dark river. The doctor's mouth opened in a scream that the hand over it prevented from becoming sound. The creature drank with what I can only describe as deliberateness, thoroughly and without hurry, and when it was finished, it drew its mouth away and licked its lips and dragged the doctor's limp body backward into the fog. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed both of them was the faint gleam of unalloyed gold on the creature's head. I remained at that window until the morning came, and the sun dissolved the fog and returned the world to something that resembled the ordinary. I was not certain what I had seen. I was not certain it had not been another nightmare, extended and unusually vivid, a product of the place and the stories in the underground chamber and my own overstimulated and sleep-deprived mind. I held on to this uncertainty with both hands. The bloodless body of Dr. Hans Ezekiel was found that morning just outside the ring of crosses surrounding the burial mound. The authorities arrived and conducted their questioning and reached their conclusions and made arrangements for the doctor's body to be returned overseas. Before I left, I took the amulet from the oak desk where it lay beside an empty whiskey glass and put it in my pocket. The officer shook his head when I finished and thanked me for the ghost story with the particular brand of dismissiveness that people use when they want you to know they find you faintly ridiculous. He told me no mummy had been found, that the tomb contained nothing of the kind, that I should go home and get some rest. I thanked him in turn and did not argue. I remained in the funeral house long after everyone else had gone, sitting with the closed casket in the empty room while the evening darkened the windows. I took the amulet from my pocket and looked at the lion with his cross and his sword facing the thing with too many teeth. And I thought about rune stones and Gothic nobles and crowns of unalloyed gold, and then I rose and put the pendant away and turned to leave. I was halfway to the door when I heard the wood creak behind me. I stopped. I did not turn around immediately. I stood very still in the center of the room and listened to the sounds that followed, the slow and effortful movement of someone pulling themselves upright, the settling of weight onto the floor, the stiff and unnatural footsteps of someone whose body was remembering how to move in it again. When I finally turned, Dr. Hans Ezekiel was standing beside the open casket, looking at me with eyes that were bright and wrong and very hungry. He said my name in a voice like something dragged over gravel and asked what had happened, and then he walked toward me with that stiff and deliberate gait, his gaze fixed on me and not wavering, carrying that hunger in it openly the way a living man would never carry anything in his eyes. He came close, very close, and then he stopped and looked down, and his expression shifted into something that might have been pain on a face that was still capable of producing it cleanly. And I followed his gaze to the amulet I was holding in my white-knuckled grip between us. The silence stretched out. Then he reached up and patted my shoulder lightly, and we both winced at the cold that came through the contact, and he stepped past me without another word and walked toward the heavy double doors at the entrance of the room. His voice came back to me one last time as he pushed them open, and the night air came in from outside. He said he thought he could use a drink, and when he smiled, the new teeth that had pushed through his bloodied gums caught the last of the light, and then he stepped out into the darkness and was gone. And I stood alone in the empty room, holding a saint's amulet in a hand that would not stop shaking, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade until there was nothing left to hear at all. Story 2. In the middle of the town there was a staircase that rose straight up into the sky, climbing past the rooftops and the chimneys and the tops of the oldest trees until it vanished into the clouds above, its upper reaches completely hidden from the ground below. Nobody in town could say with certainty how long it had been there or who had built it, and after enough generations had passed, the questions had stopped being asked. It was simply there, the way the town square was there, and the well was there, a fixed and unremarkable feature of daily life that everyone had grown up accepting without examination. Once a year, when the date came around, they held the holiday they called Ascension Day. The whole town gathered in the square around the base of the staircase, dressed in their best clothes, and they drew a name from a deck of cards that had been used for this purpose for as long as anyone could remember. The cards were old and soft at the edges, from decades of handling, and the name drawn was considered a great honor, a mark of distinction that the chosen person's family would carry with pride for years afterward. The town believed, and had always believed, that those who climbed were received somewhere above the clouds into something better than what they had left behind. And that belief had been passed from parents to children so many times over so many years that it had the weight and texture of fact. The name chosen on this particular Ascension Day was Caleb. He was a boy, young enough that his collar still needed straightening by someone taller, and when his name was read aloud, the crowd around him erupted. People pressed forward to give him food for the journey and to press a small good luck charm into his hands, and their faces were bright and celebratory in the way of people participating in something they have been taught to celebrate. Caleb's older brother Edward stood among them. He fixed Caleb's collar with careful hands and pulled him into a long hug, and when he finally let go, his eyes were wet. He told himself the tears were from pride. He told himself he would see his brother again, that the tradition was true and good, and that Caleb was going somewhere worth going. He told himself all of these things with the practiced conviction of someone who had been telling them to himself for years. The guard at the base of the staircase pressed a hand briefly to Caleb's chest, checking something that was never explained and never questioned. and then stepped aside without a word. Caleb began to climb. The crowd cheered, loud and warm, their voices rising with him as he went up and up, one step at a time, growing smaller against the pale sky until the clouds closed around him and he disappeared entirely. The cheering continued for a moment after he vanished, and then it softened, and then it stopped, and the crowd began to disperse in the gentle and slightly restless way that crowds do when the thing they assembled for has concluded. Edward stood at the base of the staircase longer than anyone else. He watched the spot where the clouds had swallowed his brother, and he could not move. Something had settled in his chest during the ceremony that he could not name and could not shake. A wrongness that sat underneath the pride and the tradition and the accepted truth of what Ascension Day meant. He did not know what it was or where it came from. He only knew that it was there and that it was heavy. He went home when the square had emptied completely, and he sat through the evening in the kind of quiet that has no peace in it. He told himself again that Caleb was fine, that the tradition held, that the tears had been appropriate, and nothing more. He went to bed when the night was full and dark and still, and he lay there in the dark with the wrongness sitting on his chest like something with weight. Then he heard the scream. It came from above, from somewhere high and far away, but it cut through the night air with a clarity that distance should have blunted entirely. It was high-pitched and brief, and it sounded exactly, precisely, unmistakably like his brother. Edward was out of bed and through the window before the sound had fully faded, dropping to the ground outside and calling Caleb's name into the dark. Nothing came back. The street was empty and the town was silent, and the night offered him nothing but the echo of his own voice. He moved through the quiet streets toward the square with the specific focus of someone who has stopped arguing with themselves about whether to do something and has simply begun doing it. He reached the base of the staircase and put his hand on the railing and looked up into the darkness above. He knew the rule as well as anyone. He had known it his whole life, had heard it stated plainly and repeated often. If you climbed without being chosen, your name would never be drawn. You would never be called. You would be outside the tradition permanently, cut off from whatever waited at the top for those who were selected properly, and you would never see the ones who had gone before you. He had understood this to mean that climbing uninvited was a kind of exile from something good. Standing at the bottom, with his hand on the railing, and the sound of his brother's scream still sitting somewhere in the back of his skull, he thought about what that understanding had always assumed. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he began to climb. The town fell away beneath him gradually, and then quickly, and then completely. The lights of the houses shrank to dim points below, and the air grew thinner as he went, each breath pulling in a little less than the one before it, and the cold intensified with every 100 steps until his hands on the railing were numb, and his exhaled breath came out in clouds that the darkness swallowed immediately. He climbed through the clouds, and the moisture of them soaked his clothes and his hair and made the steps slippery beneath his feet. And he climbed past the clouds, and above them into an air that was cold and clear and utterly silent. He could not see the ground. He could not see anything below him. There was only the staircase continuing upward, and the dark sky above it, and the extraordinary stillness of a place that existed completely outside the world he had come from. The top came without warning. The staircase ended at a landing, and at the far edge of the landing there was a door. It was large, much larger than any door he had seen before, built of something dark and old, its surface marked with the kind of wear that accumulates over centuries rather than years. He stood before it for a moment, with his numb hands and his unsteady breathing, and the scream still living somewhere inside his chest, and then he pushed it open. It moved with a low groan that resonated through the landing and through the soles of his feet and through his sternum. A sound produced by something very heavy that had not been moved in some time. The room beyond it was long and lit with a quality of light that he could not identify a source for. A table ran most of the length of it, and seated on either side of the table were figures. He could not look at them directly, not because of anything physically preventing it, but because the looking itself produced in him an immediate and total wrongness, a revolt of every instinct he had, so that his eyes kept sliding away, and then being forced back. They were large and very still, and they were watching him. In the center of the table there was a collection of trays, covered the kind used for formal meals, their lids polished to a shine that reflected the sourceless light back in long smears. One of the figures nearest to him reached out with a hand that was too long and too deliberate in its movement, and lifted the lid from the largest tray. Edward did not make a sound. He could not. The sound had left him entirely. Caleb lay in the tray, arranged with a careful and horrible precision, his wrists and ankles bound, an apple pressed into his open mouth. His eyes were open. They moved. They found Edward's face across the length of the room, and they held on to it with the desperate focus of someone who has been waiting for exactly this, who has been holding on to consciousness for exactly this reason, and they did not let go. He was alive. His chest moved in shallow and rapid increments that were barely visible but unmistakable once Edward saw them. He was alive, and he was here, and the figures on either side of the table had not moved since the lid was lifted, and were watching Edward now with whatever served them for attention. Edward turned. He turned completely and reached for the door through which he had come, his body operating on something more basic and more urgent than thought. And he pulled at the handle with hands that could barely grip from the cold he needed to get down. He needed to get back to the town. He needed to find someone, anyone, who could help him do something he had no words for yet, because he had not gotten that far. He needed to move. The wind came from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. It hit the door before he could get it open, and slammed it shut with a force that shook the walls and the floor, and rattled the polished lids on all the other trays on the long table. All the other trays he had not let himself count. The sound of it filled the room, and then faded into the sourceless light and the terrible stillness. And in the silence that followed, from the center of the largest tray, Caleb's eyes were still open and still looking at him, and the figures had not moved, and the door was closed, and there was nowhere left to go. Story 3. I have carried this memory with me for most of my life, picking it up and putting it back down again, the way you do with something you cannot quite make sense of, but cannot quite let go of either. For a long time I never spoke about it to anyone, not because I was ashamed of it exactly, but because there is a particular kind of experience that lives in a category all its own, the kind that feels completely real and completely impossible at the same time. And you learn early that sharing those experiences tends to go one of two ways. Either the person you tell dismisses it entirely and you feel foolish, or they look at you with that particular careful expression that means they are deciding how seriously to take you. Neither outcome felt worth the risk. So I kept it to myself for decades and let it exist in that quiet on and off place in my memory where certain things settle when you are not sure what to do with them. Then a couple of years ago, I told my brother. I sat with the words for a moment before I said them, the way you do when you are about to describe something that sounds stranger out loud than it does inside your own head. And when I finished, he went very still. Not the stillness of someone politely waiting to respond, but the stillness of someone whose internal architecture has just shifted without warning. He told me he had the exact same memory, not a similar one, not a version of it that could be explained away by shared household mythology or overheard conversations between adults. The same memory from a similar age, in the same house with the same quality of realness to it, that had kept it sitting in his mind for all these years without fading. This Christmas I told my sister. She went cold. That is the only way I can describe her reaction. A visible and immediate coldness that moved across her face, and she told me it had happened to her too. I am 42 years old and the eldest of my siblings. 2 out of 3 of us share this memory, and the third, the sister who does not have this particular experience in her recollection, has her own version of something strange from childhood, which is the memory of looking down at herself sleeping. Not dreaming about looking down at herself, but the clear and persisting memory of being positioned above her own body and watching it lying there in the bed below her. Different shape, same essential territory. The memory itself is this. I was around 5 years old, and I would get out of bed while everyone else in the house was asleep. I would go to the top of the stairs and I would jump. Not fall, not tumble, but jump with the full intention and expectation of floating. And that is exactly what would happen. I would drift down to the bottom of the staircase slowly and softly, with none of the impact or fear that jumping from that height in waking life would involve. And then I would run back up and do it again. I cannot tell you how many times this happened, or across how many nights, because memory at that age does not keep reliable records of frequency. But the strength of it, the way it has stayed with me with a clarity that most childhood memories do not retain across nearly 4 decades, tells me it was not a single isolated incident. It happened enough times that it became something familiar, something I apparently went back to willingly. The house where this happened was not just the house I grew up in. It was the house my mother and her siblings grew up in before us, a family home in the older sense of the phrase, a place that had absorbed multiple generations of the same bloodline. My uncle, who grew up there himself, has memories of strange things happening in that house that align with things I remember and things my siblings remember. Descriptions that match without us having compared notes first. A place does not have to be what people typically call haunted to carry something. Sometimes it is more like a frequency. Something in the walls or the air or the accumulated weight of everything that has happened inside a space over many years. And certain people are simply more tuned to receive it than others. My mother's side of the family is of Roma heritage, and there is a long thread running through the women on that side of documented sensitivity. What the family has always referred to simply as gifts, stretching back further than anyone still living can personally verify. Hundreds of years of it passed quietly through the generations the way certain traits are passed, not always skipping, but not always landing either. I am a man, and I know that in most tellings of this kind of family history, it is the women who are spoken of in these terms. But I also know from my own experience, and from watching certain men in my family, my uncle among them, that it does not observe those boundaries as strictly as the stories suggest. Some of us have a way with this regardless of where the formal tradition places the gift. As a child, I saw things, not frequently and not always clearly, but in the direct and unambiguous way that children sometimes see things before the world has finished teaching them not to. As an adult, it has shifted into something less visual and more felt, a sensitivity to atmosphere, to the particular weight of certain rooms or moments or people, a knowing that arrives without a clear source. I have come to trust it the way you come to trust any reliable sense, not because it always gives me information I want, but because it has never given me nothing. What I keep returning to is the question of what was actually happening on those nights at the top of the stairs. The most straightforward framing is that my siblings and I were having spontaneous out-of-body experiences as young children, which is more documented than most people realize, and which tends to occur more readily in children before the rational mind has fully consolidated its grip on what the body is supposed to be able to do. The experience of floating, of existing outside physical weight and physical consequence, is described consistently across out-of-body accounts in ways that match what I remember from those nights. The fact that it happened to multiple children in the same house, independently, and apparently without any of us telling the others, suggests something about the environment itself, about that house, and what it held. That was facilitating or inviting those experiences in minds that were still open enough to have them. I have never said any of this out loud to anyone outside my immediate family until now. There is something about finally having the corroboration of my brother and sister that made it feel possible to bring it into the open, to let it exist in language rather than just in memory. I am not looking to convince anyone of anything. I am not entirely sure what I believe about the mechanics of what happened. I only know that 3 people who grew up in the same house, from a family with a long and documented relationship with things that sit outside ordinary experience, all carry the same impossible memory, and that it is too specific and too consistent to be coincidence, and that the house itself has a history that stretches back through our family long enough that whatever lives in it has had plenty of time to make itself known to the children who grew up within its walls. If you have had something like this, I would genuinely like to know, not to compare notes in any clinical sense, but because these things feel less strange and less isolating when they are shared, and I spent a very long time not sharing this one. Story 4. There are a few things I want to establish before I get into what actually happened, because I think context matters here, and I want anyone reading this to understand exactly what kind of account this is. I was 1999. I was not frightened beforehand. I was not in any kind of anxious or suggestible state of mind, and I had no particular framework for ghosts or the supernatural at that age. I simply did not know enough about those concepts for them to be coloring my perception of anything. I am now in my 30s. I do not have any psychological disorders. I am telling this as plainly and as accurately as I can, and I will let it be, whatever it is. We were renting a house at the time, my mother and my brother and I, a place we lived in from 1999 to 2000. The family who owned it was Indian, which becomes relevant later in a way I could not have anticipated at the time. It was a nice summer day, the kind of day that makes being indoors feel like a waste, and my mom was outside teaching my brother and me how to rollerblade. Everyone was outside. The house was empty. Nobody was inside at all. I needed to use the bathroom, so I went in alone and headed upstairs. When I reached the top of the staircase, I heard footsteps, not from below, not from outside, but from the hallway that ran to my left. off the landing. I looked in that direction. The hallway had 4 rooms opening off it. Nearest to me was the bathroom. Door closed. Across from the bathroom was my brother's room, also closed. Further down was my mother's room, door open. At the far end of the hallway was my room, also with the door open. Standing in that hallway was a young man. He appeared to be in his late teens or early 20s. He was Indian, and he was wearing a white traditional garment of the kind worn to funerals. He was not walking slowly or drifting or doing anything that belonged to the category of how people imagine ghosts to move. He jogged, that is the most accurate word for it. He moved with a brisk, purposeful energy down the hallway toward the far end and went through the open door of my room. I lost visual on him the moment he passed through the doorway. I followed immediately. I did not hesitate, and I was not afraid, which looking back strikes me as significant, because the absence of fear is not something I have ever been able to fully explain. I simply followed him, the way you follow anyone who moves out of your line of sight into a room, with the expectation of finding them on the other side of the door. I walked straight into my room. I never took my eyes off that doorway from the moment he entered it to the moment I stepped through it myself. He was not there. I went through the room completely, checking everything, every corner, every space. My mother came inside when I called her, and we searched it again together with the same result. The window was closed. There was no other exit. There was nowhere he could have gone, and no way he could have gotten out of that room in the time between him entering it and me following him through the same door. The encounters did not stop there. On one occasion, I was asleep, and something struck me in the back, hard enough to wake me and hard enough to leave a mark that my mother saw. It had never happened before, and it has never happened since. My mother took it seriously enough to bring a priest to the house. Eventually, we moved out, and for a long time the whole thing settled into the back of my memory, where things go when you have no category for them and no way to process them, and life continues moving forward regardless. I forgot about it. Not permanently, not completely, but practically, in the way that unusual childhood experiences can go dormant under the accumulated weight of growing up and getting on with things. It stayed quiet in me until 2015. I was 23 when I met the son of the family who had owned that house. We became friends through ordinary circumstances, and I had never connected him to that period of my childhood, or if I had never raised it. I certainly never mentioned what had happened to me in that house. I had barely spoken about it at all, only to my mother. One day, without any prompting from me, without any mention of the house or my time living there, or anything adjacent to it, he brought up something that had stayed with him from his own childhood. He said that the first funeral he had ever attended was for his 19-year-old cousin, and that it had happened in 1997. He described the image that had stayed with him from that day, his cousin lying in the white funeral garment, and he said it had genuinely traumatized him in the way that unexpected death at close range traumatizes a child who was not prepared for it. Then he mentioned that the cousin had lived in the house his family owned, the house I had rented, the house where I was 6 years old and followed a young Indian man in a white funeral garment down a hallway and into a room he never came out of. He kept talking. He told me that after the cousin died, the family members who had been living in the house began seeing something there, a presence. something they could not explain, and that it disturbed them enough that they decided to leave. His father, the landlord, had assumed this was the product of grief and trauma, the mind doing what minds do when they are in pain and looking for somewhere to put it. He had rented the house to another family, and then another, and he told me that every family who had lived in that house since the cousin's death had reported strange things happening there, consistently and independently of one another, across years of different tenants. Then he looked at me and asked whether I had experienced anything while I was living there. I did not know what to do with my face in that moment. I did not know what to do with any of it. He was not asking the question in a way that suggested he was playing with me or testing me. He was asking the way someone asks when they already half know the answer and are tired of the question sitting unanswered. And the fact of it, the complete and verifiable fact of it, was that I had never told him anything. I had never told anyone except my mother. There was no way he could have known, no thread connecting his story to mine, except the house itself and what had been moving through it since 1997. My jaw dropped. That is not a figure of speech. I felt the information move through me in a way that rearranged something, that took what had been a strange and isolated childhood memory and placed it inside a context that made it undeniable. A 19-year-old died in 1997. 2 years later, I saw a young Indian man in white funeral clothes jogging down the hallway of that house with no explanation for where he came from or where he went. The family before us saw something and left because of it. Every family after us experienced something they could not explain, and the landlord's own son was sitting across from me asking if I had seen anything. Not because he thought I was the kind of person who believed in these things, but because the pattern had become too consistent to keep dismissing. I am a believer now. I do not use that word lightly, and I did not arrive at it easily. I spent years being the kind of person who held these things at arm's length, who preferred uncertainty to commitment, who did not want to claim more than could be directly verified. But I saw what I saw with 6-year-old eyes that had no expectation or template for it. And years later, a man who had no knowledge of my experience handed me the exact piece of information that made everything fit together without a gap. The young man in the white clothes was real, or was something. He had lived in that house. He had died at 19, and for reasons that I cannot explain, and have spent years trying to, he had not entirely left. I just wish I had a framework that could hold all of it properly. I have the experience, and I have the corroboration, and I have the absolute certainty that I am not confused or misremembering or embellishing. What I do not have is the explanation, and I have come to think that the explanation may simply not be available in any language I currently have access to. That some things sit just outside the edge of what we can articulate, and that the most honest thing to do with them is exactly this: to put them into words as carefully as possible and let them stand on their own. Story 5. This is a memory that tastes like copper and old lace, and I have spent 40 years trying to convince myself that what my sister and I saw in the summer of 1976 was nothing more than a heat hallucination, the kind of thing that a sweltering afternoon and 2 overactive teenage imaginations could conjure together without any outside help. I have tried that explanation on and off across 4 decades, holding it up to the light and checking it for holes, and it has never quite held. The scars on my sister's soul say otherwise. Some things leave marks that outlast every reasonable explanation you can offer them. My name is Sally, and I need to tell you what happened. We were playing in a secluded grove near the edge of town, my older sister Roxanne and I. In that particular way, that summer afternoons in 1976 allowed you to play, with nowhere to be and no one tracking your location and the entire green world feeling like it belonged to you specifically. I was 16. Roxanne was 17. We were two young black girls lost in a sea of green and heat, and the particular freedom that came from being old enough to wander and young enough to still find wonder in the wandering. The world felt infinite in those days, in a way that I have spent the years since trying to recover some fragment of, and mostly failing. Then the colors changed, and she was there. She was sitting on a fallen log as if she had always been there, as if the grove had been arranged around her rather than the other way around. Her skin was as dark as ours, but her hair was a shocking luminous white, piled high beneath a matching black and white headpiece that sat on her head with the authority of something ceremonial. Her face was a canvas of shadows, gothic eyeshadow applied with precision around dark eyes, black lipstick, black nail polish on every finger and every visible toe. She looked like she had stepped out of a dark storybook, the kind where the beautiful woman is never simply beautiful, but is always beautiful and something else besides. She was wearing a traditional European dirndl, which was the last thing I would have expected to see on a woman sitting on a log in a grove outside our town in the summer of 1976. And the strangeness of it is something I have never been able to fully process. A white off-the-shoulder blouse with short puffed sleeves and ruffled lace at the cuffs, fitted with a black bodice over it that had intricate decorative trim running along its edges. The skirt was heavy black fabric falling to T-length, and over it a small white apron tied with a wide band of black and white trim. Every time she shifted her weight even slightly, the tiered white eyelet petticoat beneath her skirt rustled in the still air like dry corn husks, like something being slowly turned. Her black, strapless, open-toed platform sandals rested against the roots of the tree she sat on, and they clicked against the wood as she looked up at us. She looked at us, and she smiled. And the smile was the thing that made my body understand before my mind did that something was wrong here. Her voice was like velvet being dragged slowly across gravel, soft and textured and wrong in a way that you felt in your chest before you heard it properly with your ears. She said we were vibrant little stars. She said our names, both of them, Roxanne and then Sally, in that order, without us having introduced ourselves or given her any way to know them. She said she had been waiting for such generous gifts, and the word gifts landed on me in a way that gifts should not land, heavy and specific and pointed at something I did not understand but did not want to. Roxanne's hand came down on my shoulder at exactly that moment, her fingernails dug in. She said nothing, because she didn't need to, because the pressure of her grip and the quality of her silence communicated everything that words would have taken longer to get to. She had seen what I had seen, which was the way the woman's shadow stretched toward us across the ground, despite the fact that the sun was positioned in a direction that should have made that geometrically impossible. Shadows fall away from the sun. This one was reaching toward us like something with its own intention. Roxanne's voice was trembling but firm when she said we had to go. She pulled me backward, and we ran, and I remember the sound of those platform sandals on the dirt behind us with a clarity that 40 years has not dimmed in the slightest. A rhythmic heavy thud clack, measured and unhurried, following us through the trees all the way to the edge of the woods. We didn't stop until we reached our porch, and even then we stood gasping and looking back at the tree line for a long time before going inside. Decades passed. The memory settled into the category of things you carry without examining too closely. The story we told ourselves to explain why we were always so careful. Why we paid attention to the edges of things. Why we never entirely trusted a secluded place on a warm afternoon. We grew up and moved to the suburbs and built lives and started families. I had my daughter Melanie and my son Ricky. Roxanne had her son Norman. We were happy in the way that people are happy when they have worked for it and know its value. And the woman in the dirndl was nothing more than a ghost from a long-lost summer. Something that had happened once and been survived and filed away. Some ghosts do not stay buried. Last autumn we took the family to a crowded harvest festival, the kind with pumpkin patches and hay bales and the smell of cider in the air. Ordinary and cheerful and lit by the particular golden light of a fall afternoon. I was watching Ricky and Melanie play near the pumpkin patch when the temperature dropped. Not the gradual dropping of the day cooling toward evening, but an immediate and localized cold that arrived without announcement and settled on the back of my neck with a crawling familiarity that I recognized before I could name what I was recognizing. I looked toward the row of tall sunflowers at the edge of the festival grounds, and I found her. She was standing completely still among them, and she was exactly as she had been 40 years ago. Not similar, not reminiscent, exactly. The same white hair, the same black lipstick, the same fitted black bodice over the white blouse with the ruffled lace at the cuffs, the same heavy black skirt with the white apron over it, the same black platform sandals. She had not aged a single day across 4 decades. The mathematics of that is something I cannot make work, no matter how I try. She stood perfectly still, with her dark eyes fixed on Norman and Ricky and Melanie, with an intensity that made the warmth of the autumn afternoon feel very far away. I grabbed Roxanne's arm and said her name and nothing else, because nothing else was necessary. Roxanne followed my gaze, and the color left her face in a single moment, the way color leaves a face when the body redirects everything to the interior because the exterior no longer matters. She said it was her. She said it was really her, and the way she said it, the quality of confirmation in it, told me that Roxanne had never stopped watching for her either. That across all the years of suburbs and children and ordinary happy life, some part of my sister had always known this moment might come. The woman began to move toward our children. The word glide is the only accurate one. Her sandals silent on the grass now, where they had been deliberate and loud in 1976, as if she was choosing now to be different, to be less heard, to arrive before we could respond. She reached into her apron pocket, and the air around her shimmered in a way that air is not supposed to shimmer, a distortion that revealed for just a moment something beneath the gothic makeup and the careful costume, something that had been using those things as a surface the way a very old and patient creature uses whatever surface is available to it. Ancient was the word my mind reached for, and hungry was the one right behind it. I understood then what she was, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives whole rather than in pieces. The old stories carried her in fragments. whispered references to something that sought the vitality of the young to maintain its own frozen beauty. Something that called what it took gifts because it had decided long ago that what it wanted from you was a gift you were giving rather than a thing it was taking. The gift taker. That was what the old stories called her. And she had known our names in a grove in 1976, and she had found our children 40 years later, and she was moving toward them through the Golden Harvest Festival light with her hand in her apron pocket. The panic was there for a moment, and then it was gone, replaced by something that moved faster and ran hotter and did not leave room for anything else. Roxanne and I moved at the same time without speaking, running toward our children, putting ourselves between them and whatever was coming across that grass. It was not a decision. It was simply what happened. The body doing what the body does when the children are in danger. The oldest and most reliable override there is. Roxanne screamed at her. "Not them," she screamed, and her voice carried across the festival grounds with a force that turned heads and stopped conversations, and she told the woman that she would never take them, that this would not happen, that whatever she had come for, she would not find it here. The gift-taker stopped. The fury that moved across her face was cold rather than hot, the contained and specific fury of something that is not accustomed to being refused and is deciding what to do with the experience. Her black polished fingers clenched at her sides. The air around her changed again, and a gust of wind came up that had no meteorological explanation, violent and localized, swirling her black skirt and white eyelet petticoats into a cyclone of fabric and dust around her feet. It lasted only a second. When it stopped, the space by the sunflowers was empty. No footprints in the soft autumn ground, no scent. Only a single black and white ribbon caught on a thorn at the edge of the flower row, which I did not touch and did not let anyone else touch, and which I thought about for a long time afterward. We gathered the children and left without explaining why, which is its own kind of difficulty when you are dealing with curious young people who want to know what happened. We moved houses not long after. We changed our routines and our routes and the places we went, and we keep our eyes on the shadows at the edges of parks and open spaces, and anywhere that the light does not quite reach. The children are older now, and they carry their own lives forward, and they do not know what their mothers turned to face in a harvest festival on an autumn afternoon, or what their mothers were protecting them from, or what the woman in the black and white dirndl had decided they were worth to her. She has not been seen since. We take that for what it is, which is not safety exactly, but the absence of confirmed threat. And we do not confuse those two things. Roxanne and I have talked about that day more in the years since than we talked about the grove in the years between, turning it over between us the way you turn something over when you need to make sure you both saw the same thing and that you are not alone in having seen it. We saw the same thing. We have always seen the same thing. And we stood between it and our children, and it left. That is the part I hold on to. Not the fear, not the impossibility of her face unchanged across 40 years, not the cold that arrived without weather and left without explanation. The part I hold is that we ran in 1976, and we did not run last autumn, and the space by the sunflowers was empty when the wind died down, and our children went home with us and did not know what they had been standing so close to. Some gifts you give willingly. Some gifts are not hers to take. And some things, no matter how old or how patient or how certain of their own power they have become, find that a mother standing her ground is a different kind of force than a teenage girl running through the woods. We pray she does not come back. We watch the shadows, and we pray. Story 6. I had only gone back for a notebook. That was all it was. One notebook left in my locker that I needed for homework, a 10-minute trip at most, in and out. I had stayed late at school before without incident, and I had no particular reason to expect anything different about that evening. I was not thinking about anything unusual. I was not in any heightened state of awareness or anxiety. I was just a person going back to retrieve something they had forgotten, the way people do all the time without anything happening. But as soon as I walked through the door, something was different. I felt it before I could identify it or put words to it. That particular shift in atmosphere that a place produces when it has changed from what it normally is into something else. The halls were quiet in a way that school halls are not supposed to be quiet, not the ordinary after-hours quiet of an empty building settling into itself, but a deeper and more deliberate silence, the kind that seems to press against you from all sides rather than simply being an absence of sound. The usual ambient noise that any building generates without anyone consciously noticing it, the hum of ventilation, the distant clank of pipes, the small mechanical sounds of a structure going about its business, all of it was gone. The silence was total, in a way that felt less like quiet and more like something holding its breath. I started walking toward my locker, and something moved at the edge of my vision. A shadow, shifting in the way that shadows shift when something causes them to, rather than when the light changes. I turned to look directly at it, and there was nothing there. Just the corridor, the lockers, the dim and ordinary geometry of a school hallway after hours. I told myself it was peripheral vision doing what peripheral vision does, playing with shapes and movement in a way that the direct gaze then corrects. I told myself that, and kept walking. Then I heard the scraping sound behind me, soft, unhurried, the sound of something being dragged across the floor tiles in a slow and deliberate way. I stopped and turned, and the hallway behind me was empty in both directions. The sound had stopped the moment I stopped, or close enough to it that the difference was not reassuring. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence that followed, and told myself it was the echo of my own footsteps, that the acoustics of an empty building do strange things with sound, that there was a completely ordinary explanation for what I had heard. I said this to myself clearly and explicitly, the way you say things when you are trying to install them as fact through repetition, and then I kept walking. When I reached my locker and bent down to retrieve the notebook from the lower section, the feeling arrived without warning and without any sensory basis I could point to. Someone was directly behind me. Not nearby, not somewhere in the general vicinity, but immediately and closely behind me, close enough that if I stood up and turned, I would be face to face with whoever it was. I froze in that bent position with my hand on the notebook, and I did not turn around. The silence pressed in around me, and I became very aware of my own breathing, and the sound of my own heartbeat, and the way the air felt against the back of my neck. Then the footsteps started, slow and deliberate, behind me, pacing me as I straightened up and began walking toward the exit, not running to catch up, not the brisk movement of someone with somewhere to be, but measured and patient, matching my pace with the specific quality of something that is not in a hurry, because it does not need to be. I called out, asking if anyone was there, and my voice went into the silence and came back with nothing. No answer, no acknowledgement, no sound of someone stopping to respond. Just the silence, and then the footsteps continuing as I walked faster. The lights flickered once, a single stuttering moment of instability, and then they went out. The emergency lighting along the base of the walls came on in their place, casting the hallway in a dim reddish glow that turned everything familiar into something less familiar. The lockers and doors and ceiling, all rendered strange by the change in quality of the light. I was halfway to the main door and still walking fast, and the footsteps behind me had not stopped. My name came as a whisper from somewhere in the hallway. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise and clear, and unmistakably my name in a voice I did not recognize and could not locate with any certainty. I stopped moving for a fraction of a second, the kind of freezing that the body produces when something unexpected arrives. And in that fraction of a second, I saw a dark shape move rapidly around the corner of a classroom doorway and disappear. Not a shadow caused by changing light, not something at the periphery that my direct gaze then corrected, something that moved with speed and intention and was gone before I could resolve it into anything identifiable. I ran. The tiles were slippery, and I was aware with every stride of the possibility of falling, but the awareness did not slow me down. I reached the main door and pushed through it, and stepped outside into the evening air, and pulled the door shut behind me, and stood there on the steps breathing hard. The feeling lifted the moment I was outside completely and immediately, the way a pressure releases when a seal is broken. One moment it was there, and the next it was simply gone, leaving me standing in the ordinary evening with my heart going fast and my hands not quite steady, and the notebook I had gone back for clutched against my chest. I was shaking the whole way home, not from cold. The evening was mild enough. The shaking was the body processing something that the mind was still working to categorize, and it did not stop until I was inside my own house with the door closed behind me. That night, I checked my phone before bed, scrolling through it the way you do without any particular purpose, and I found a video I had no memory of recording. It showed an empty hallway, shot from roughly chest height, at an angle consistent with a phone held loosely at someone's side, or pulled out briefly without conscious attention. The hallway in the video was the hallway of the school. The lighting in it was the dim emergency lighting that had come on after the main lights went out. For most of the video's length, there was nothing, just the empty hallway and the quality of silence that a recording captures differently from the way you hear silence in person. And then, at the very end of it, clearly audible, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. And behind them, faint, but there, a whisper that was my name. I watched it several times, holding my phone closer to my face with each viewing, as if proximity would resolve it into something explainable. It did not. I still do not know when it was recorded, or how, whether my hand had activated the camera without my awareness during one of the moments I was most frightened, or whether some other explanation exists that I have not been able to find. I kept the video for a while, and then deleted it because having it on my phone was not something I could continue to accommodate. The memory of what it showed is sufficient. Months later, without me having told anyone what had happened to me, 2 of my friends mentioned separately that they had also stayed late at school. On different occasions and for different reasons, and that each of them had experienced things they could not explain. Doors moving without anyone near them, footsteps in empty corridors, cold spots in specific sections of hallway that had no ventilation or drafting explanation, localized patches of cold that you walked through and then out of, their boundaries distinct enough to feel like crossing a threshold. One of them said she had seen something move at the edge of her vision and turned to find nothing there, which was close enough to my own first experience in that hallway that something in my chest tightened when she described it. None of us had stayed late since. We compared what had happened to us with the careful and slightly embarrassed energy of people sharing experiences they are not sure they will be believed about. And none of us could explain any of it. And none of us wanted to go back and investigate further. And all of us had arrived independently at the same conclusion, which was that the school after hours was not the same place as the school during the day, that something about the empty building, or something within it, was different when the students and teachers, an ordinary daily noise, had gone, and the hallways were silent, and the light had changed, and there was no one around to provide the presence that keeps certain things from becoming noticeable. I walk past the school sometimes at night, on the way to or from somewhere else, and I do not look at the windows for long. There is a sinking feeling that arrives reliably when I do, a dropping of the stomach that I associate specifically with the memory of those footsteps pacing me down the dim hallway, and I have learned to look away before the feeling can fully establish itself. I do not know what is in there. I do not know if it is something that has always been there and simply reveals itself when the conditions are right, or something that arrived at some point and stayed, or something without a history or an origin that I could locate even if I tried. What I know is that it knew my name, that it knew it in a way that did not require me to introduce myself, and that it followed me all the way to the door and stopped there, and that the feeling lifted the instant I was outside, as if the threshold meant something to it. I will not be going back after hours, not for a notebook, not for anything else. Whatever is worth retrieving from a locker is not worth retrieving badly enough to go back into that building alone after the lights have changed and the hallways have gone quiet, and whatever occupies the empty spaces of that place has had time to notice you are there. Some mistakes you make once, and they are enough. That was mine, and it was more than sufficient to last me the rest of my life. Story 7. I am a married woman with a 3-month-old baby girl, and we live out in rural Utah, far enough from anything that the nights here are a different kind of dark than most people are used to. I feel almost embarrassed writing this out because part of me keeps insisting that there has to be a rational explanation, that I am a new mother running on almost no sleep, and my mind is doing things that sleep-deprived minds do. My wife, Elle, says exactly that. She says I was imagining it, that I'm being an idiot, and that I should get some rest. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I cannot make myself feel okay about any of it, no matter how many times I try to talk myself down, which is why I'm sitting here at 4:45 in the morning typing this out while my daughter sleeps in my arms, because I am not putting her back in that crib tonight. Our daughter's name is Melissa. She is 3 months old, and she is the most important thing in my life. And what I am about to describe happened maybe an hour ago. So it is still very fresh, and my hands are still not entirely steady. It was somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. I don't know the exact time because I had been drifting in and out of that shallow, always listening sleep that new parents live in, where you are never fully under because some part of you is always tuned to the frequency of the baby monitor. Melissa started crying, and it was not her normal cry. I want to be specific about this because I know her cries now the way I know my own voice. I know the hunger cry, the discomfort cry, the tired cry, the I just startled myself cry. This was not any of those. This was a cry I had never heard from her before, a full-bodied, desperate sound that communicated something much closer to terror than any of the things a 3-month-old is usually crying about. I looked over at Elle, and she was awake too, or half awake, and she mouthed at me to go check on her, the way we have worked out between us in these early months. I agreed and got up and walked toward the door of our room, which opens onto the hallway across from Melissa's room. Before I opened our door, I heard a sound coming from her room. It was smooth and sliding, mechanical almost. The very specific sound of a window being opened, a kind of sound that has a particular quality when the frame moves along the track. I know that sound. I've opened that window myself. That was what I heard. I pushed open the door and crossed the hallway and opened the door to her room. The window was open, and there was an arm coming through it. I am going to describe this as accurately as I can because I need someone to understand what I actually saw, rather than a softened version of it. The arm was long and very thin and white, not the white of pale human skin, but a brighter white, a wrong white, the color of something that has never been in sunlight. It was reaching through the open window with its hand positioned directly above Melissa's crib. The hand was not a human hand, or not entirely. It had 2 fingers, long and thin, and at the end of each finger there was a claw. The overall shape of it was somewhere between a human hand and something insect-like. The proportions subtly but unmistakably wrong in a way that my brain registered before I had time to consciously analyze what I was looking at. I blinked, the kind of blink that happens when your eyes are trying to reset, to confirm or deny what they're receiving. It was a fraction of a second, the fastest possible blink, and when my eyes opened again, the arm was gone and the window was in the process of closing. I watched it finish closing. That detail matters to me, and I keep coming back to it. Because Elle told me later that I must have left the window open myself and that the curtain was moving in the wind, and that I saw what I expected to see in a half-asleep state. But the window closed. I watched it close from the inside. Windows don't close themselves from the outside, and curtains don't make the sound of a window sliding in its track. I screamed. I ran to the crib and grabbed Melissa and pulled her against my chest, and she was screaming too, harder than before, the loudest I have ever heard her cry, and I was calling for Elle at the top of my voice. I looked out the window while I held Melissa, and there was nothing visible outside, just the darkness and the tree line where the forest begins at the edge of our unfenced yard. Whatever it was gone. Elle came in, and I told her everything, every detail, as fast as I could get it out. She looked at me the way she has been looking at me lately when she thinks I need more sleep, and she explained it back to me as the curtain moving in the wind. Said Melissa was crying because the room had gotten cold from the open window that I had apparently left open myself. She was calm and certain, and she wanted us both to go back to bed. I pointed out to her that Melissa's curtains are pink, not white, The thing I saw reaching through the window was white in a way that had nothing to do with curtains or fabric or anything soft. She told me we were both exhausted and that I should feed Melissa and get some rest, and we would talk in the morning with clearer heads. I am not going to sleep. I understand that Elle is trying to be the reasonable one, the grounded one, and I love her for how steady she usually is. But I need someone outside of this house to tell me whether what I'm describing sounds like the product of a tired and overstimulated new mother's mind, or whether it sounds like something that I should be taking seriously. Because here is the thing that I cannot let go of, no matter how hard I try. I know the difference between a curtain and an arm. I know the difference between fabric moving in a breeze and something with fingers and claws positioned above my daughter's face. I know what a window sounds like when it opens, and I know what it looks like when it closes. And I watched it close from the inside after whatever was attached to that arm pulled it back through. Melissa is in my arms right now. She has calmed down, and she is breathing steadily, and she looks fine. She looks perfectly fine, and I am so grateful for that. But I cannot put her back in that crib. I cannot put her back in that room. I cannot go back to sleep in this house tonight, and I do not know what to do about tomorrow and the day after that, and every night that follows, because I am home alone with her during the day, while Elle is at work, and this house is surrounded by nothing but open land and tree line, and there is no fence, and there is a window in my daughter's room that something was reaching through less than an hour ago. I know I might be worrying too much. I am genuinely open to that possibility. But I am also terrified that I am not worrying enough. And I don't know which one it is. And I don't know who to ask. And Elle is asleep, and I am sitting here in the hallway outside Melissa's room with my daughter against my chest and the lights on. And I needed to tell someone what happened. Please just tell me honestly, does this sound like something, or does it sound like nothing? Because I cannot tell anymore, and that might be the most frightening part of all of this. It is 4:45 in the morning, and I am not going back to sleep. Story 8. I never wanted the cameras. That was Sarah's idea entirely, born out of the kind of fear that takes root in a neighborhood after something bad happens nearby. 2 houses down, a burglary, and suddenly Sarah couldn't sleep without checking the locks twice and lying awake listening to ordinary house sounds that she had never noticed before. She held up her phone one evening and showed me what she had found: a doorbell camera and 2 interior ones. The Ring system, inexpensive and easy to install, and she said it with the particular tone she uses when she has already decided something and is presenting it to me as a conversation. Just these 3, she said. Cheap, simple, and then we would both feel better. I was tired in the way that becomes permanent when you are working 12-hour days in a design job that never fully lets go of you, while also helping raise 2 kids under 8 who have their own gravitational pull on every remaining hour. I didn't have the energy to negotiate. I downloaded the app, put in a few screws, and 20 minutes later we were, according to Sarah, safe. The first week gave me nothing to worry about. I would check the app at work the way other people check sports scores or social media, a reflex more than a necessity, and what I found was ordinary and even pleasant. Tommy riding his bike in circles in the driveway. Emma doing her spinning thing in the living room to the song she had been obsessed with for weeks, the one we had all heard approximately 400 times. Sarah waving at the doorbell camera when she went to get the mail, a small, deliberate wave like she was sending me a message, and I suppose she was. It felt like being connected to home, even when I wasn't there, which was exactly what Sarah had promised it would feel like. Then came the Tuesday, when I worked late. My phone buzzed with a motion alert from the living room camera at 9:47 in the evening. I opened it expecting the couch and the lamp and the empty room. Instead, I saw Sarah sitting cross-legged on the floor with Emma, the two of them working on a block tower together. Emma's face doing the concentrated, serious thing it does when she is trying very hard at something. Tommy was stretched out beside them with his tablet, laughing at something on the screen. The timestamp said they should have been asleep for an hour. I smiled at it. Kids staying up past bedtime is annoying in person and somehow charming on a small screen from a distance. I texted Sarah to tease her about it. She replied immediately. Kids had been asleep since 8. She was already in bed reading. Drive safe. I sat with both messages on my screen for a long moment. I looked at the footage again. On the camera feed, Sarah looked up toward the lens and smiled. It was a specific smile, one I recognized not because it was her happy smile, but because it was the other one, the one she produces when she is trying to appear fine, the performance of okay rather than the real thing. I had last seen it the night the doctor told us Emma would need surgery. I told myself it was a technical problem. Cloud lag, a timestamp error, old footage playing back in the wrong order somehow. There was always an explanation for things like this. Technology glitches. I went home and said nothing about it. Wednesday the same thing happened, but with more detail. I was sitting in traffic when the kitchen camera sent an alert. The family on screen was eating ice cream straight from the carton, standing at the counter at 10 in the evening, laughing about something. Sarah's hair was pulled back in a ponytail she stopped wearing more than a year ago. Emma's pajamas had small yellow ducks printed on them. I had thrown those pajamas out months earlier when Emma outgrew them. I remembered doing it specifically because Emma had been annoyed about it and had made her feelings known at some length. When I walked through the front door, the house was dark and quiet. Sarah came into the hallway in her old sleep shirt. She told me there were leftovers in the fridge. There was no ice cream carton on the counter. Emma was in her room in different pajamas. I showed Sarah the clip, and she watched it twice and laughed the way she laughs when the credit card bill is higher than expected. A nervous sound with no humor in it. She said, "It must be old footage." I told her the app doesn't store old footage unless you pay for the premium plan, and we had never paid for the premium plan. She didn't have an answer for that, and after a while we both stopped talking about it and went to bed. By Thursday, I had moved from confused to methodical in the way I get when something is bothering me, and I need to feel like I am doing something about it. I left work at noon, told Sarah I had a dentist appointment, and parked 3 blocks away from the house. Then I sat in the car and opened the app and waited. At 9 in the evening, the backyard camera triggered. My family was playing flashlight tag in the yard. All of them, Sarah and both kids, running in the dark in the cold of an October night, laughing, calling to each other. Tommy's voice coming through the small speaker on my phone with perfect clarity. Sarah was using the sing-song tone she gets when she is pretending to be annoyed, but isn't really. And then I watched myself walk out the back door and join them, smiling, holding a flashlight, clearly having a wonderful time in my backyard at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening. I was sitting in my car 3 blocks away. My heart was going hard enough that I could feel it in my back teeth. I drove home. The house was quiet. Sarah was folding laundry. Both kids were in bed. The backyard was empty and cold, and nobody had been outside. I did not sleep that night. I spent Friday deleting and reinstalling the app, hoping that the problem was in the software and that a fresh installation would clear whatever was causing it. It didn't clear. The footage became sharper, if anything, more detailed, more clearly what it was, rather than less. I started thinking of them as the replacements. That was the word that arrived in my head and stayed there, and I did not examine it too carefully, because examining it meant taking it seriously. Saturday night, I told Sarah I was going up to the attic to organize the Christmas decorations. What I actually did was crouch behind a box of old photo albums with my phone brightness turned all the way down and wait in the dark. Every camera triggered at once at 11:19. The living room feed showed a figure standing in the center of the room, looking directly into the lens. She had Sarah's face and Sarah's hair and Sarah's clothes, but the eyes were slightly too wide, and the smile was assembled incorrectly. The way something looks when it has studied a thing carefully, but has not yet fully understood it. Behind her, 2 smaller figures stood completely still, with their heads tilted at identical angles. The children, or the things wearing the children. They began walking toward the camera. Below me, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Real footsteps, light and careful, the specific weight and rhythm of someone I knew. Sarah's voice came up soft and a little worried, asking if I was okay up there. On my phone screen, the other Sarah raised one finger to her lips, a shushing gesture, slow and deliberate, directed at the camera. Then she pointed at the lens, directly and without any ambiguity, and shaped 3 words with her mouth that I could read clearly in the low light of the living room below. He is upstairs. The attic door creaked open behind me. I kept my eyes on the phone. I could not make myself turn around. On the screen, the replacement figures were climbing stairs, their movement perfectly synchronized with the real footsteps I could hear on the attic steps behind me. Sarah's actual voice, warm and tired and concerned, told me the kids were asking where I had gone and that I should come down. On the screen, the other Sarah reached the top of the stairs and looked into the camera one last time. She smiled exactly the way my wife smiles when she is about to say she loves me, with the particular softness around her eyes that I have memorized without meaning to over years of watching her face. Except the smile continued past the point where it should have stopped. It kept widening. There were too many teeth arranged in too much space, and none of them were quite right. I turned around. Sarah stood in the attic doorway with the hallway light behind her. She looked exactly as she always looks when she hasn't slept enough, which is still somehow beautiful in a way that is specific to her and that I have never been able to adequately explain to anyone. She looked completely normal. Behind her on the stairs, there were 3 figures. They wore the same clothes and had the same hair and the same tired expressions in their eyes. Their chests were still. Sarah looked back over her shoulder at them, then looked at me again. Her voice had gone small in a way I did not recognize. She said that they had told her I would understand eventually. I looked down at my phone. The live view had shifted to the attic camera. It showed me standing in the attic holding my phone with my eyes wide, and it showed 4 figures standing behind me. One of them raised a hand and waved at the camera with the pleasant, cooperative gesture of someone who knows they are being filmed. and wants to be friendly about it. The doorbell camera sent a new alert. I opened it with fingers that were not entirely steady. On the front porch, in the doorbell camera's fisheye view, there was a man wearing my flannel shirt and my 5 o'clock shadow and my particular brand of end-of-week exhaustion. He looked at the camera the way you look at something familiar, with recognition rather than curiosity. Then he raised his hand and knocked 3 times, unhurried, patient, polite in the way of someone who knows the door will open. He mouthed the same 3 words. He is upstairs. Downstairs, I heard the front door open. The app sent another alert. Motion detected inside the house now, in the hallway, moving toward the stairs. I closed the app. There was nothing else the footage could show me that I needed to see. The cameras had been doing their job the entire time. They had been recording exactly what was there to be recorded. The glitch was never in the system. The version of me that just walked through the front door is somewhere in the house right now, learning the rooms, testing the weight of the furniture, practicing the way I move through familiar spaces, getting comfortable in a life that still has my name on it. He is patient. He has been patient through all of it, appearing on the cameras night after night, letting me watch, letting me almost understand what was coming. That patience is probably the most frightening thing about him. He doesn't need to rush. He already knows how this ends. The cameras never lied, not once. They just showed me the truth in an order I wasn't ready for. The ending before the middle. The replacement before the thing being replaced understood it was being replaced at all. I don't know what happens when the version of me downstairs finishes learning how to be me. I don't know what that smile looks like up close when it goes too wide. I don't know what he does with the things that are no longer needed once the copy is complete enough to stop needing the original as a reference. I know the app is still open on my phone. I know the attic camera is still recording, and I know that whatever is standing behind me right now has been there long enough to know I can see it on the screen. It's waving again. Story 9. I remember the day everything began. The sky was impossibly clear, the kind of wide blue that makes you forget the world can break. Soft white clouds drifted lazily overhead, and an eagle circled high above, as if it owned the morning. Summer was close. You could feel it in the warmth rising from the pavement and in the slow, comfortable hum of the city waking up. Then, something changed. The eagle faltered mid-flight. Its wings twitched as though the air had thickened into something hostile. For a split second it hovered awkwardly, fighting gravity, and then it folded inward and dropped straight down. It didn't spiral or glide. It fell like a thrown spear. The impact was sudden and sickening. It crashed directly into a man standing beside me, its beak piercing his skull with a wet crack. He collapsed instantly. There wasn't even time for him to scream. That was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. I remember the feeling that followed more clearly than the image itself. A burning sensation spread through my head, as if red veins were crawling beneath my skin, branching outward like warning lights. Even now, I sometimes wonder if I've been trapped in that moment ever since, forced to relive the ending over and over again. The strange reports began with rats, then birds, then livestock. Each time the aggression was worse, faster, more deliberate. Whatever it was spreading and learning. What followed wasn't the catastrophe. It was just the beginning. Harsh woke from that memory as if dragged up from deep water. The man had died. There was no soft way to think about it, no way to make it less violent in his mind. Outside, the world acted as if nothing had happened. Traffic moved. Neighbors left for work. Morning routines continued. But the news was already starting to whisper about something spreading among rodents. "I hope it's nothing serious," Harsh muttered while brushing his teeth. The reflection staring back at him didn't look convinced. "I'm sure it's fine," Chaya said gently, setting his iron shirt on the couch. She tried to sound calm, but there was tension in her voice. He nodded and peeked into Shravia's room. She was still asleep, her breathing steady and soft. She looked older every day. 12 already. Time had flown by so quickly it felt stolen. The word flew, triggered the memory again. He saw the eagle dropping, the sound of bone breaking, the spray of blood. His stomach twisted violently. He leaned forward, expecting to vomit, but nothing came. Later that morning, he sat in front of the TV, trying to drown out his thoughts with noise. The reporter spoke with forced composure. Scientists were calling it TAV, the aggressor virus. It was affecting rodents first. Infected animals became violently hostile, attacking everything around them. When confined together, they fought until only one survived, often consuming the others. Brain scans showed unusual patterns, activity that researchers couldn't explain. For now, it appeared limited to rodents. There was no need to worry. Harsh wasn't reassured. He went to work under a sky that looked just as peaceful as the day before. To everyone else, it was an ordinary day, but for him, normal had shifted into something fragile. That night, he jolted awake with a sharp pain tearing through his head. Memories flashed like lightning, images of blood, screaming, snapping jaws. He stood up slowly. The apartment was dim, lit only by street lights filtering through curtains. Chaya was asleep. He drank water and turned on the TV, flipping through channels aimlessly. Nothing felt real. Eventually, he opened his laptop and started scrolling through news feeds. That was when he found it. TAV was no longer confined to rodents. Birds and livestock were infected now. Reports were scattered, buried under entertainment headlines and trending nonsense. No official statement from the World Health Organization. No urgency. It feels wrong, he muttered. The images in the article made his stomach churn. The infected animals behaved exactly as he'd seen before. Unnatural aggression, escalating violence. It was as if something inside them had been switched on. "No, it's not fine," he whispered. The next morning confirmed what he feared. TAV had crossed into humans. The WHO declared a pandemic within hours. The details were terrifyingly simple. The virus spread through contact between infected blood and healthy tissue. No cure, no timeline, no reassurance. Cities collapsed first. Hospitals overflowed. Governments failed. Eventually, even the organizations meant to protect humanity disappeared. Silence became rare. Screams replaced sirens. Nights were the worst. Teeth rattling, snarls outside the building. The sounds of infected tearing into one another. They always slowed eventually. That meant feeding. Harsh remembered watching from his window as armed civilians poured into the streets, determined to eliminate the infected themselves. Bullets didn't stop them. By nightfall, the streets were covered in bodies, both infected and human. He had locked himself in the bathroom and cried. Now, weeks later, food and water were running out. "I'll go," Chaya offered quietly one morning. He shook his head. He couldn't risk losing her. Shravya needed her mother. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The building was coated in dried blood. The smell of rot clung to every surface. Flies buzzed lazily over dark stains on the walls. He moved cautiously from apartment to apartment. Most were empty, stripped of anything useful. Then he heard it. A distant screech. He froze as an infected appeared at the end of the corridor. It moved strangely, quick, calculating. He pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath. H-E-L-P. The word scraped out of its throat in broken syllables. He had never heard one speak before. Two infected suddenly collided in violent combat, tearing at each other. He slipped away while they were distracted. Outside, the city felt abandoned, but not empty. The infected roamed in strange patterns, almost territorial. They were no longer mindless. They adapted. He spotted a supply container from an early military drop. Relief washed over him, until he saw another survivor approaching it. The man was thin, pale, desperate. He pulled a knife when he saw Harsh. "This is mine," the stranger said. "I just need enough for my family," Harsh replied, hands raised. But desperation doesn't share. The fight was brutal and clumsy. The man's strength faltered from hunger. Harsh knocked him down with a rock and a kick. Before either could recover, an infected screamed nearby. The infected attacked the weaker target first. The man was torn apart in seconds. Harsh seized the fallen knife and killed the infected, stabbing until its skull collapsed. He loaded the supplies onto a broken cart and dragged them home, constantly scanning for movement. At the entrance of his building, he saw a mangled body and felt dread tighten his chest. Another infected stepped from the shadows. He barely made it inside. Chaya opened the door and pulled him in. Crying with relief, he tried to speak, but something was wrong. S-T-O-P. The broken syllables came from his own mouth. Cold realization hit him. He was infected. He pushed Chaya away gently. He looked toward Shravya's bedroom, grateful she was still asleep. He didn't want her to see what he was becoming. Without another word, he climbed over the railing and jumped. The fall felt slow, peaceful. His body hit the ground. His eyes opened. He was still there, still conscious, but he couldn't control himself. His limbs moved without permission. His body crawled forward, broken and wrong. He wasn't dead. He was trapped. Inside every infected human was a mind still aware, screaming silently as the body betrayed it. H-E-L-P. The words tore from his throat again. He understood now. The infected were prisoners in their own flesh, watching, powerless. Harsh remembered the day it began, the eagle falling from the sky, and he knew the nightmare would not end until his mind finally gave up. Until then, he would crawl, and somewhere deep inside, he would keep remembering. Story 10. Our lock was never simple. Most front doors are straightforward. You slide the bolt, turn the key, and that's it. Ours wasn't like that. Ours had a routine, almost like it demanded a ceremony before it agreed to protect you. You had to twist the handle to the right first, then lock it with the key, then turn the handle back to the left. If it rested straight, The door wasn't actually secured. Turned left meant locked. Anything else meant open. I knew that because I checked it obsessively. The apartment itself wasn't in a dangerous area. It wasn't luxury either, but it was decent enough. Still, I've always been paranoid. I read too much. I scroll too much. I've read about people being followed home from grocery stores, about killers slipping into unlocked apartments, about women who thought they were safe until they weren't. If I'm being honest, I probably am an easy target. I'm clumsy, I overthink everything, and I'm almost always carrying too many things to react properly if something actually happened. I live with my younger sister, Al. We share a 2-bedroom apartment. The front door opens into a short hallway. Her room is first on the right, then mine further down. From either bedroom, you can't see into the living room. If someone stood in the middle of it, we wouldn't know. That night felt completely normal. Around 9:30, I got into bed. It was one of those nights where you finally get comfortable and don't want to move ever again. The blankets were warm, the room was quiet, and I made the laziest possible decision. "Al," I called from my bed. "Can you check the front doors locked?" She replied from her room. It sounded like a tired yeah. I didn't get up. I didn't check it myself. I trusted that she'd done it, rolled over, and fell asleep. I woke up at 12:30 to wind hammering the building. The blinds were slapping against the window so violently that for a second, I genuinely thought someone was knocking. Half asleep and irritated, I got up, fixed the window latch properly, and crawled back into bed. I had just started to relax when I heard something else. Footsteps, not outside, inside the apartment. I froze instantly. They were soft, but they were unmistakable. They were just outside my room. Slow steps. Then they moved away, down the hallway toward the living room. At first, I forced logic into the situation. Al. It had to be Al. Maybe she couldn't sleep. Maybe she was getting water. Then I heard the sofa creak once. Then again, heavier this time. The unmistakable sound of someone sitting down. My throat went dry. If it was Al, why wasn't she turning on a light? Why was she sitting in the dark? Why was she just there? Then came a small, dull, rhythmic sound against the base of the sofa. Not random, not loud, just a steady, quiet tapping, like someone sitting and gently swinging their legs. Every single hair on my body stood up. If someone had come through the front door, they would have passed Al's room first. That realization hit me like a punch to the chest. For a split second, I almost called out her name. I'm so glad I didn't. The footsteps started again. They left the living room. They came back down the hallway. Only this time, they were slower, deliberate, measured. Like whoever it was already knew exactly where I was. My hand shot out from my phone. In the living room, we had a smart lamp connected to an app. I could turn it on remotely, change the brightness, switch the color. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone, but I managed to open the app and hit on. A second later, muted blue light spilled into the living room. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long pause, they moved away from my door, back toward the living room. That was my window. I slid off my bed as quietly as I could and dropped to the floor. The hallway tiles were freezing against my legs as I crawled toward Al's room. Her door was shut, I pushed it open slowly and slipped inside. She was asleep, completely still, completely undisturbed. For 1 second, relief hit me so hard it almost made me cry. I shook her. "Al," I whispered urgently. "Get up. Now. We have to go." She blinked awake, confused, but something in my face must have told her everything she needed to know. She didn't argue. She got up immediately. We crouched by her door and listened. Silence. Too much silence. I opened the door. We dropped to our hands and knees and crawled toward the front door. We were almost there when the footsteps came back. Not from down the hall, from the living room. They paused for half a second, like whatever was in there had just noticed us. Then they charged, not slow, not quiet. A full sprint down the hallway. Al screamed first. Adrenaline took over. I grabbed the handle, yanked the front door open, and we both stumbled out barefoot into the corridor, nearly tripping over each other as we ran toward the lifts. I turned back only once, just long enough to slam the apartment door shut, and in that split second, I saw it. Something was standing inside our hallway. It looked like me, not perfectly, but close enough that my brain recognized it before it understood it. The hair was mine. The height was mine. The posture was mine. The other half was wrapped in white gauze. The bandages were soaked through with dark, spreading stains. Fresh blood seeped at the edges, running down into its neck. And it was smiling. The lift was already there. Doors open. I don't remember getting inside. I just remember jabbing the button for the ground floor over and over, while Al sobbed beside me, and I stared at the floor numbers like they were the only thing keeping us alive. We called the police from downstairs. Everything after that felt detached, unreal. They came quickly, took statements, searched the apartment, the stairwell, the lobby, the underground parking. They checked windows, locks, cameras, bins outside. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no intruder. One of the officers gently suggested that storms can make people disoriented when they wake suddenly. That fear can distort memory. That maybe we heard ordinary noises and panic filled in the rest. For a moment, I almost believed him. Then I remembered the lock. Even in the chaos of escaping, I had felt it when I grabbed the door. The handle had still been turned left. Locked. The blood drained from my face when I realized what that meant. No one had unlocked the door to get in, and no one had unlocked it to get out. I told them. They looked at each other at first, like maybe I was still in shock, but one officer went upstairs to check it himself. When he came back down, his expression had changed. He confirmed the lock worked exactly the way I described. And when they entered the apartment, they had used our spare key. I kept asking the same question. If the door was locked, how did it get in? He never answered. Maybe because he couldn't. Or maybe because by then, we both knew that wasn't the right question. I haven't slept properly since. Every night I check the door myself. I twist it right. I lock it. I turn it left. Then I check it. Again and again. But that isn't what keeps me awake. What keeps me awake is what one of the officers said quietly before he left. He asked, very carefully, "When you first heard the footsteps, are you absolutely sure they came from outside your room?" I didn't understand at first. Then he told me what they found in my bedroom. Not a person, Not a weapon, just deep scratch marks on the inside of my closet door, long splintered gouges in the wood, like something had been trying to get out. Very, very quietly.